Hello, everybody. This is Tosca at NGO Soul+Strategy. Today, we are going to talk about foresight. We're going to talk about trend spotting. We're going to talk about how civil society organizations can be a step ahead. And a term that I frankly had never heard, namely anticipatory capacity. What is that, right? So how can we as civil society anticipate our futures better? And what do we need to do to get there? So let me introduce the topic a little bit before I introduce our two speakers. So this podcast episode is about how we can gauge what may happen in the future, but also how we as civil society can better shape our future. That sounds like a mouthful. I'm not a futurologist at all. I only have a medium level of understanding about scenario thinking myself, for instance, or how to spot trends. And then we have to overlay that topic with the topic of civic space. So the extent to which there is both politically, legally, and societally a welcoming space for civil society organizations to do their work. And as we know that space has been decreasing steadily since the early 2000s. And frankly, civil society has been in a fairly reactive crouch on this topic, some people might say. So the question is, can we apply better foresight? And can we be more proactive rather than reactive? It's pretty complex stuff. But I have two people on the show today who know a lot about this. And that is Heather Hutchings and Danny Vannucchi, who as consultants wrote a report on anticipatory capacity for the International Civil Society Center. So, Danny and Heather, welcome.
Thanks, Tosca. I'm really pleased to be here.
Thanks for having us.
Oh, it's my absolute pleasure to have both of you. It's going to be a rich conversation. So let me introduce one more thing to you before I ask Danny and Heather to please offer us their short bio. So let's set the stage a little bit by mapping the current landscape of civic space. Okay. We have noticed that particularly for progressive groups in civil society, that space has at the very least shifted, if not shrunken. And I know that there is discussion about whether these terms are even the right ones, but let's not go there today. So we're talking about backsliding of liberal democracies. We're talking about digital authoritarianism. We're talking about online and offline civic spaces that are switched off, disinformation, you name it. We're talking about anti-rights groups that claim civic space to advocate for regressive agendas. I think we've all seen a lot of that. That's the kind of threatening landscape. We could argue that civil society often finds itself. But then again, the question is, what can we do about it, and can we be more proactive? So Danny and Heather, maybe starting with you, Heather, can you please offer a little bio to yourself and how what you've done in the past made you set up really well to be invited by the International Civil Society Center to write this really interesting report?
Sure, and thank you. I'm glad that you found the report really interesting. It was certainly a lot of fun and fascinating to do the research for it and to write it. So I work independently from Hong Kong, which is where I live, supporting nonprofit organizations on organizational development, strategy development, and conflict transformation. I've been doing that since 2021. And prior to that, I worked for 15 years for Amnesty International. So my background is really in human rights, but in the organizational side. So I like to say more the human than the right side. And I'm particularly interested and have just been fascinated on a personal level in the sort of complex entanglement of people, of relationships, of organizations in systems and networks. So when I was at Amnesty, one of the last projects that I led was a complexity-informed program around China's influence abroad. And I think it was that sort of thinking, that network design of a project and that systems change thinking that is what I brought to this particular project.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, and you and I know each other from a while back when a small team and I were involved in an assessment of Amnesty's global transition program at that time. And Danny, over to you. Please offer us your bio and how that relates to the topic of the report.
Thanks, Tosca. Yes, so I'm an NGO strategist and human rights practitioner. I've worked in the global NGO space for over 15 years, most recently at Amnesty International, where I also worked with Heather, where I was the director of global strategy and impact. So overseeing the organization's impact assessment work, but also helping the organization design its 10-year strategy. So quite a hefty process, which definitely exposed me to a lot of these questions, right? Something that I'm very interested in terms of the role of transnational NGOs in today's world, and how do you bring together the internal and the external reflections in such a process. Now, since leaving Amnesty, I'm an independent consultant. I work with several human rights organizations, NGOs. I lead the strategic facilitation practice at a design and research agency called Grid Impact. And I'm also an adjunct professor at UCLA Law School, teaching human rights advocacy. And this is where I'm based. I'm based in LA.
Ah, that's good. And so you and I share a little bit of that, a little bit of a background in what I call pracademics, right? Yeah, where we bring practice into academia and back again, if you will. So let's start first with you, Danny. There are several terms in the report that I felt I needed definitions on, and the report gives those, but our audience doesn't know that, right? So let's start there. You use terms like futures thinking, anticipatory capacity, and action, you mentioned that, and the difference between foresight and forecasting.
Yeah, thanks for asking that. I think that's actually one of the most interesting and surprising points that I think have come from this process, as we were talking to several practitioners, civil society experts, foresight experts. And one of the key points that really emerged is that there seems to be some confusion really between foresight and forecast. And I think this was really a light bulb moment, even for me as a practitioner, because I probably was making that mistake.
Me too.
Yeah. So the way that I can summarize it best is for me is foresight is really about imagining a potential future, right? And consolidating your strategy and shaping the collective vision of the future. So what might the future look like, and how does your organization has a role in that future? So really, this is about developing strategy and helping your strategy be future-proof. And we know there's lots of tools that can be used, from trend scanning, scenario building. But again, it's really aimed at imagining the future and developing your strategy in view of that future. Well, forecasting is something about something much more pragmatic and operational, which is really about mitigating risks, right? It's about identifying early warning systems for whether it's a crisis or whether your operations are going to be affected, and responding to that information that you see. So really, forecasting is about mitigating risks, identifying and mitigating risk. And the biggest confusion that a lot of the practitioners have talked to us about is that what's been happening is that people have been using foresight tools to do forecasting, right? So you're developing scenarios to actually try and mitigate the risk for the future. But the crux of it is that foresight is not about predicting the future. That's not what the point of it is. It's about imagining potential different futures, different scenarios that can help you develop better strategy. And the same thing happens on the other way around, where a lot of strategy work about the future of an organization is actually being led by forecast data. So for example, and I've certainly been in those rooms, in those conversations where forecasting about fundraising, for example, which is really hard data, it's numbers, there's a science really behind it. And that information on forecasting is used to inform the future strategy of an organization. So there's a little bit of misalignment there that I think has been really interesting for us to see. And it really, I think, goes back to a misunderstanding primarily about foresight, right? And the fact that really this is not about predicting the future, but about helping you with strategy, you know, and it is helping organizations develop what their version of the future is.
Okay.
Something, yeah, that we think has been misunderstood.
Right. Yes. And I certainly thought, yeah, that's good that I'm learning this from reading this report. Futures thinking and anticipatory capacity and action. I think it's clearer now that you've done this, but will you just give us a brief definition of each of those?
I think the key term, I think, is anticipatory capacity, right? And what do we build? How do we build anticipatory capacity? We started this work with a strong framing of crisis, but I think we realized that it's not only about predicting crisis, it's also about trying to imagine the future, and that makes you better at anticipating and working with different futures. So for me, and what has emerged from the report is that really in order to develop anticipatory capacity, you need to do both. You need to do both foresight and forecasting. You need to both try to be ahead of the crises that are coming, but also try to be ahead of the trends that might inform potential futures coming forward.
Yeah. It's pretty heady stuff, right? I'm saying spontaneously and pretty conceptual stuff. So I'm glad we're going to talk a little bit more about this. So let me turn, Heather, to another what shall I call it, misunderstood set of concepts that you mentioned in the report, and that is crises and trends. How are they misunderstood and how are they actually different?
Sure. So as Danny said, I think the original framing for this report was around crisis. And as you said, Tosca, it was about how to get civil society organizations out of this reactive crouch, this sort of crisis response, this reactive response. And the framing was, what can we learn from crises, both the way that they are framed and the way that they are manipulated, I suppose, by states or other actors to shrink civic space. And also how civil society organizations respond to them, and what can we learn from that to inform future preparedness for crisis. And actually what Danny and I found as we were doing this is that civil society organizations' crisis responses are quite well honed. You know, there is quite a good system of forecasting and being able to predict these and being able to respond rapidly to them, to mobilize in emergency. And we might come on later to the pervasiveness of the crisis mindset across the sector, which I think serves it well in crisis situations. But what we found was that there was less of a emphasis or less of a perception of the trends that are underlying these crises. So these crises we understood as manifestations of, so the sort of spikes, as it were, the surface level spikes of things that were happening below the surface. So broader shifts, trends, social, political, economic trends that weren't standalone, but that they were intersecting, you know, in quite complex ways over the long term. And if, as I've said before, my part of my practice is conflict transformation. So whether it's on a personal level or a social level, if you're only dealing with those surface manifestations, you're never really getting to the root of the issue. And I think that this is where we try to draw a distinction between crisis and trend, where if we're only as a sector addressing the manifestations in the crises, we're never really getting to neither anticipate and nor importantly shape the trends in a positive direction. So you're not getting hold of them, you're only ever responding to what's coming at you, and you're never really trying to shape those trends to have influence over them, which I think civil society is super well set up to do, and needs to be able to do, to make those futures positive and inclusive.
And just very briefly, Tosca, to give a practical example of this, because it was interesting to reflect on past crises as well, and how and you know, civil society might have dealt with them. And you know, there was a lot that was going back all the way to the response to 9/11 and how the crisis of the counterterrorism and human rights, for example, reaction. You know, there's a lot of reflections coming from there, where obviously there was this, assault to human rights, to torture, arbitrary detention in the name of security. And, civil society responded at the time really well, pivoting it with crisis programs. And there was huge, impact that arrived from it. But in hindsight, there's a reflection there that perhaps there was a missed opportunity to really think about the long-term trends that this was going to cause into the world and operations. There was maybe a missed opportunity there so civil society were always on the defense. They were always in crisis mode when it comes to counterterrorism and human rights work, while perhaps there was a missed opportunity to imagine what kind of world can we imagine where security and human rights actually come together. There wasn't an opportunity to work with the intelligence community to think, how do we really bring in their legitimate concerns and developing a future and a strategy in the long term. So this, again, is an interesting reflection as to something that perhaps was a missed opportunity at the time. And again, civil society was always stuck in the short-term crisis mentality.
Yeah, I love what you just said, and particularly what we might have been able to do with the security apparatus, for instance, in a way that was actually had more longer term impacts than what we did. Yeah. Now, in the report, and I'm going to invite either of you to respond to those points that I'm going to raise now. You talk about a number of civil society weaknesses, kind of structural weaknesses and barriers, right? So as both of you have already said, civil society tends to have good crisis response mechanisms, on average, right? And capacity, including when it comes to threats to its own organization. But you said bringing this crisis framework to act on trends, and you've just been explaining, Heather was explaining that difference, that are actually longer term, intersecting and systemic. So tell me more about the pitfalls of bringing a crisis framework to act on trends. Who wants to go first?
Sure, I can take the first one of that. I think there's so much to say on this. I'll definitely see what Danny would add to this. I think, as Danny had said there's a missed opportunity for transformational change. So I'll actually just riff then off the security example, because I think there was also learning from that could have then been applied to COVID. I think was a great example of this, where there was a huge mobilization. The organizations that we spoke to really did incredible stuff to totally pivot from being advocacy organizations to service provision, being organizations that were focused on one particular aspect of rights or civil liberties, to focusing on health and the injustices that were exposed by COVID. But there was this moment, and I think somebody's quoted it beautifully in the report, about this possibility for transforming the total inequality that was exposed and exacerbated by COVID, and yet nothing was done. I think we all remember that there was this moment of life could be different when everything sort of stopped and was turned upside down by COVID, but then nothing changed. And I think there was a sense from people that we spoke to in the report that the crisis response had been good, but this opportunity to look at some of the complex factors that were underlying the way that COVID had manifested, there was no sense of grabbing hold of that opportunity and shaping some of those changes and shaping society and driving it into a different future. So I think there's that real moment for that missed transformational change. And I think in some ways there's a bit of a reductive view when you're looking just at a crisis, both missing the multiple factors of the crises. And I think that this is so common and understandable across the sector, because everybody is focused on, not only doing the great work that organizations do, but being able to secure the funding and the visibility to keep doing that work. But there is a sense that we came across of organizations who are operating in crisis environments, really looking at the crisis through the solution that they have. So how are we going to frame this crisis in a way that we can fix it? And so there isn't then, because NGOs, civil society organizations, and again, this is a different barrier, but aren't well coming together in crises to look at, to unpack the crises in its multiple dimensions, and time being one of those multiple dimensions. How has this happened? What's contributed to it? As Danny said, what are the implications going forward? How might we project in the future? We're not getting those multiple perspectives of different organizations and different times, and we're looking just at, this is a crisis that we can contribute to, and we'll see it through that lens. There are many more, but I'm going to stop there and see what Danny would add.
Okay, and before Danny, before you jump in, if you would like to, just to our listeners, I just want to point out, even though we have mentioned several examples from on the human rights side of the sectors that civil society works in, squarely this report speaks to cross-sectoral concerns. So it's not just about the human rights or legal and political space for civil society that was severely shifted and infringed upon, but it's also relevant for other sectors. Danny, you want to add to that?
No, you're absolutely right, and I think we see it even in terms of some of the trends that we've seen that affect all NGOs, right? All organizations, not just human rights ones. Another important weakness that we found is perhaps a more mundane and internal one, is really a lack of being able to shift from analysis to action when it comes to foresight. We all know what the trends are. We can get a bunch of clever people in a room and figure out what are the biggest trends that affect our work. But really the big challenge is making sure that decisions are actually taken on the basis of that analysis.
Exactly.
And as some of it perhaps is coming, some of the feedback we were hearing is, those who have foresight expertise are sometimes not in the room where the decisions are made, or the information isn't brought to the attention of senior leaders. But there's also something around, and this is human to an extent, where senior leaders and managers want to see concrete outputs for the analysis that's been done. And perhaps there's a little bit of overemphasis on creating outputs around foresight. We see a lot of perhaps even duplication of efforts around every organization wanting to do their own scenario development, right? Their own scenario planning. There was also one respondent, one person that we were talking to was saying, at my organization was almost more keen to make sure that the analysis was bottom up than how the analysis would actually be used. So I understand a lot of it is also about the cost that these, analysis take. So people want to see something that comes out of it, but it doesn't have to be an output. People don't have to reinvent the wheel. It's just making sure that decisions are taken on the basis of that. Our program stopping, our program starting on the basis of foresight and trend analysis.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And if I could just jump in there as well, because it takes me back to something that you said at the beginning, Tosca. You said, I'm not a futurologist. And I think that this is also really key, is that not everybody, this isn't the preserve of futurologists. This is everybody's, it's within everybody's possibility and everybody's responsibility at whatever level of the organization, is to be thinking about futures, and not only what's coming at you, but how to grab hold of that and shape that across the entire organization. It's really not the preserve of a few in their tower to create these reports. And it isn't a one and done or a once a year type activity. It's something that really needs to be across the mindset of the organization. So again, I think shifting from this crisis action mindset to this futures action mindset is really key.
One comment and then a question to follow up immediately on this. I'm glad you brought that up right away. I love, Danny, what you said about people were more concerned, as one of your interviewees says, with, is there enough bottom-up engagement or input into the identifying of trends, etc., than whether there was actually action taken on. I think that's actually, in my own view, quite frequently a blind spot, if you will. I want to go deeper into that mindset issue and the culture behind it. And I remember now when the two of you did a presentation to the International Civil Societies Gathering last, October? There were a couple of people, including myself, who were pushing a little bit, but so how, since we continue to hear that we do a better job in analyzing, but we're still not really acting upon it. So what, and so I'm very interested in organizational culture, but also organizational systems and processes, not in a bureaucratic way, but how do you think now at the end of this exercise, what are the best ways to, from an organizational mechanics as well as mindset perspective, to have this anticipatory ability result in actual changes in decisions and in action of the civil society organization? Who wants to go in on that?
Well, I think in a way, as Heather said, we're all futurists. We should all be futurists. In a way, the fact that we now have a term to say foresight, I mean, I'm sure the foresight experts are going to shudder at this, but in a way, maybe that's also part of the problem. I think that's, we all do trend scanning in our own way. We all try and think about, future scenarios in our own way. To me, a key component is making sure that people understand that this is about just organizing, this is just about strategy development and good strategy development. In the same way that we say impact assessment is a key component of planning your project, trend scanning and future foresight is part of your planning. And I'm thinking if we can really try and make it as a regular, I'm thinking really practically, really internally, really part of the program development cycle, that is something that might help. So that's at the program level. At the senior leadership level, I think it's just putting that information in front of the senior leaders and making sure that there's the boldness to take decisions that is based on information that may not be science as forecast, but still is pretty valuable.
But what do we do then, as you say that, and this is a quote in the report, a lot of NGOs think of this anticipatory stuff, especially foresight, as a luxury good. Heather?
So I think that's a great question, and it always comes down to funding, doesn't it? But I think and again, it's that old adage that what you measure matters, and what matters gets measured. And I think that applies here in terms of it is something that needs to be prioritized, and we need to find ways to measure the value of foresight. And until you actually invest in foresight and futures thinking, and you measure the value of doing that, I think that's always going to be a challenge. So I would definitely, as Danny said, build that into practice and be looking at how is this valuable and different from the way that we might have done things previously. But what I would really add to what Danny said is the difference of scale. So I think definitely there are great recommendations in our report, but elsewhere, and through the brilliant work that Danny and others like myself do with organizations about how to build this into your practice. I think at a systems level, at the whole sector level, this is also where the biggest potential is in terms of connecting organizations, as you said, fully across the sector, not human rights organizations or humanitarian organizations, but bringing cross-sector perspectives to collective foresight, collective narrative development, because these aren't issues, the trends that we're talking about and that you listed at the beginning, Tosca, are not things that affect one organization or one part of the sector. They affect the entire space of civil society. And so I think there is this collective responsibility and the power collectively to respond to those, both in terms of the foresight, developing scenarios, developing narratives. I think organizations like the Civil Society Centre are well placed to create those spaces. But that's, I think, really what we're missing. And that's not a negative thing. It means that there's loads of potential to foster that connection across organizations, as well as developing this practice within organizations. And that's what I would really love to see in the future. I think that's where we hold the potential for transformational change.
So maybe we should go there as those to some of your recommendations, because we have to be mindful of our time together. So let me turn to those recommendations now, and let me just let's start with a broad question. Danny, maybe to you first. How might we balance responding to crisis and tackling underlying systemic drivers? Do you feel there's more we should talk about, or do you feel the two of you have addressed that?
I mean, I think there's an answer here that is about, how internally programs are planned and making sure that short-term and long-term planning is coming together and making sure that happens. I suspect this is all stuff that is going to sound like common sense to good managers, right? And good leaders. There are some recommendations that I think came from the report that are perhaps a little bit more surprising to me, or interesting. And
tell us.
Things like, when you look at funding, for example, we always think, oh, we just need more funding on this. The feedback was actually that the funding community had responded pretty well to this, and they had adapted. They'd been very adaptable. They'd been very flexible when crisis happens to pivot funding and let organizations just run with it. So that was something that we felt it was important to acknowledge, because that's something that the funding community did really well, and organizations thrived because of that. That's definitely something to lean in on. Again, leaning on the role that funders have is thinking about not just asking whether a strategic vision is developed, but how was your strategic vision developed, right? And making sure that organizations are integrating foresight and anticipatory capacity in the way that they develop strategy. So there's a real role there that foresight, that funding actors have. But also building on Heather's point around collective knowledge, it was interesting to see that there were several ideas put forward around maybe creating sort of resource hubs for civil society. Organizations don't necessarily need to bring in and hire in expertise, about foresight, but a bunch of other things that are really on trend at the moment, from narrative work to tech. Can we think about creating organizations or agencies that are there to support civil society in a way like the International Civil Society Center is? There's a lot of interesting resource hub coming, I think, up in the narrative space, from Hardwired to the Narrative Hub. Let's think more about these sort of resource hubs that can really support civil society and in becoming better at anticipating future and dealing with it.
I see. I'm going to ask Heather first and Danny to respond briefly, because we're almost out of time, around this whole point of narratives, because that's another one that is pretty abstract, right? Let's face it, for many of us. So maybe Heather, what is it about narratives that is important for having anticipatory capacity? And then maybe to you, Danny, around how does the whole aspiration of our sector to decolonize aid and our own practices as civil society organizations and diversity, how do these topics intersect with anticipatory capacity? So Heather, first about narratives. Tell us in practical terms, why is that important for this?
Sure. And in some ways, I think this question should be flipped. Danny is definitely the narratives expert, and I am much more focused on the decolonization and diversity. But let me give it a go. We can both answer each. I mean, my short answer on narratives from and perhaps this is useful from a less expert perspective, is that this is an area that is actually really well developed across the sector. In most of the bigger organizations that we spoke with, and there are individual practitioners who are doing fabulous work on narratives. I think the key thing that Danny and I observed was the need to bring narratives and foresight together, so that we have this developing narratives of what is the value of civic space for everybody, and what is the role of civil society organizations in holding and growing that space. So how can we use the excellent narrative capacity across the sector to really tell the story about why civic space is important to people, and the risks to your individual lives of that shrinking of civic space, even unpacking the word shrinking of civic space, which means nothing to most people who don't work in the sector. And trying to get out of this narrative trap where civil society organizations are increasingly trying to justify their existence or say what they are not. We are not liberal lefties, we are not the wokerati, we are not terrorists, trying to battle against that. So that would be my response to that. But Danny, go ahead and refine that.
That sounds great. I mean, what I would just add is the way that narratives and foresight also come together is that, I think there is a tendency to develop maybe future scenarios and a foresight vision around futures that we don't want to see. And I think actually when it's about developing new narratives, foresight can really help you develop the future that you do want to see, that you do want to work toward. So what kind of narrative you need to push out as an organization that gets you to that future, right? I think that's really the bit that the next step for a lot of organizations. Don't just map out the scenarios that you're trying to prepare for, but the ones that you're also trying to really advocate for. And on decolonization, again, Heather has done more thinking of this, but there's organizations are struggling with this and just trying to figure out what does this mean in practice, really. For me, there's a couple of really simple things that I think can really help your anticipatory practice be more decolonized. And in a way, it's as simple as making sure that you think about who's in the room when scenario and trans-scanning is done. Are all voices represented? But also, and I caught myself doing this myself when, what are the resources that you pinpoint to? What are the academics that you are citing when you're trying to develop, doing an analysis of trends? There's a lot that you can do by really bringing in the relevant voices. This is a small thing, but I think it's these kind of really practical things that people are trying to identify. That was one that sort of resonated with me.
That makes sense to me. And also the fact probably that a lot of my lay understanding of foresight and futures thinking, so that it's heavily private sector initiated and informed. It's fairly heavily, I assume, tell me if I'm wrong, global north informed, etc. Heather, any comments on what Danny just said?
Yeah, I guess I would just add a little bit on the why, and 2 points that really interested me. I think one is, I hope the Civil Society Centre would not mind me saying this, because I think they do incredible work. But I think their view on this replicated most other organisations that we spoke to, which is, well, we have a programme of work already on decolonisation and diversity. We don't need to bring it into this conversation. And our view is, no, that's exactly why you do. I mean, we are talking about multiple and intersecting trends here. We are talking about everything coming together, and the responses need to bring everything together. It's not enough to say, well, we talk about futures in this room, and next door, that's where we're going to talk about decolonisation and diversity. No, they have to come together, as do most, everything else that we're dealing with as organisations, which is not easy. One of the things that did really surprise me that came out of this report was that crisis responses actually can contribute to that colonial attitude and behaviours across the sector, and can really entrench that inequality in terms of who has the power, the way that the money, aka power, flows between, as you said, the global north and the global south, between donors and beneficiaries. And so I think that there is a conceptual level that thinking more about futures, and as Danny said, inclusive futures and positive futures where everybody is represented, can help us really rethink some of those power structures and those inequalities that are replicated in, and therefore exacerbated by, continued by, this crisis mindset and this response constantly in a crisis mode.
Yeah, and maybe if I can very quickly interject something that I'm interested in when it comes to individual leadership styles, etc., is that we know from the research on psychology and social as well as political psychology that when leaders and managers are under pressure, they tend to become more their lens on the world narrows, shrinks,
right,
if you will, right? So the integration that Heather just talked about is not at all what's happening. And in fact, we're going back to what we knew used to work at some point in the past, right? So even at an individual level, I could see how how that can be challenging unless we're very self-aware on that.
Exactly. It's that threat response, right? At an individual level, at an organizational level, at a sector-wide level, it reduces the capacity for creativity, communication, collaboration. You're exactly right.
All these things. Yeah. So yeah. Okay. With that, we need to bring this to a close. So let me ask you, maybe Danny, starting first, if people want to know about this report and also about you, where should they go? You're on mute.
There you go. Hi. So people can find me on LinkedIn, and the report is, I believe, is available on the International Center for Civil Society. The work isn't done because the project is continuing. So there's a lot more exciting work coming.
Oh, good. Yeah, and I'll summarize that on behalf of the center who asked me to do it in a moment. But Heather, how about you? Where can people find out more about your current and future work? No pun intended.
Similarly on LinkedIn, I'd be really pleased to be contacted.
Okay, that's very clear then. Well, then let me just, as Danny just told us, I would like you, dear listeners, to know that the International Civil Society Center, which is based in Berlin, but it really has global presence, is now, and which initiated this work and this report, is now moving into the next phase with a process whereby they will invite several people from across the sectors, as we've said, they will be putting forth scenario narratives, and the center will then ask commentators to review these. 5 scenarios will be shortlisted, as I understand, and then civil society members of the center will determine what they want to do in response. If you're interested to partner with the International Civil Society Center, then please contact Miriam Niehaus at the center, and we will put the link and her email address in the show notes. So please go there if you would like to partner. So with that, thank you, Heather and Danny, for all your insights on this pretty conceptual, but so very important topic. I hope the podcast helps you wrap your mind around this as the report did for me. Thank you, listeners. If you found this podcast episode stimulating, be sure to check out other episodes of my podcast, NGO Soul+Strategy, which you will find on my website, 5oaksconsulting.org with the number 5, as well as on my YouTube channel. And in the book that I'm a co-author of, and that happens to be called Between Power and Irrelevance, the Future of Transnational NGOs, you will find some content on this topic as well. And with that, this is Tosca, and I look forward to spending time with you on NGO Soul and Strategy next time.